From the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, this is Trending Globally. I'm Dan Richards. Watson fellow Marc Dunkelman's newest book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Get It Back, was partially inspired by his old commute.
So I live here in Providence. For a long time I worked in New York, and I was frequently taking the train from Providence to New York and arriving in Penn Station.
Penn Station, the busiest train station in the United States.
More people go through Penn Station every day than go through LaGuardia, Kennedy, and Newark airports combined. Essentially the front door to the world's most important city.
A front door which, for much of its modern history, has been a total bummer to use.
This rat's nest of underground warrens, just a depressing, horrible situation.
If you've ever traveled through Penn Station, you know. Despite some recent renovations and an expansion that opened in 2021, much of the station is still located underground beneath Madison Square Garden. It is dark, crowded, and difficult to navigate. And as Marc was commuting through Penn Station, he was reading a book.
Robert Caro's 1975 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Power Broker, which is about Robert Moses, who between the 1930s and the 1960s really remade the physical landscape of New York City.
Robert Moses was an urban planner who, it should be noted, was never elected to an office in New York City. And yet, through his appointments to various boards and commissions in the state, Moses
built highways, he built parks, he built housing developments, he built the Lincoln Center, the UN headquarters, you sort of name it. He just completely remade the entire landscape of the city in his own image.
One of his most famous, or rather infamous projects,
the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway.
The project, which involved demolishing entire blocks of working-class neighborhoods in the Bronx and displacing countless Bronx residents, was not popular.
Everyone opposed Moses. Not only the community activists, not only the Bronx leadership, but the mayor of New York City was opposed to the project. And Moses just turned a deaf ear to all of them. And he built this highway. It was the 1950s. By the time that the Power Broker comes out 15, 20 years later, the highway has effectively turned the South Bronx into a wasteland.
Marc read this story on one of those train rides from Providence to New York City.
And I'm thinking to myself, why is it that Robert Moses was able to get a bad project going with everyone screaming no? And yet I know that people have been calling for the reconstruction of a beautiful Penn Station, probably for 20 years at that point. And I genuinely didn't know what had happened between the moment when Moses built the Cross Bronx and the period where Penn Station was just stuck. And so I set off to explain it.
What Marc found was a story about much more than one train station in one American city. He found a surprising history of ideological and cultural change in American politics in the last half-century that hobbled government's ability to make good on ambitious projects. And perhaps most surprisingly, many of the most profound changes Marc identified didn't come from movements or parties we often associate with small government in the U.S. They came largely from America's progressives. The story Marc tells helps to explain so many of the challenges we face as a country today, as well as why our government seems unable to address them. On this episode, you'll hear from him about how progressives got in their own way when it comes to achieving ambitious government projects, why that's bad for all of us, and how progressives might get their own movement and the rest of the country to build big things again. To understand what Marc found, we have to go back a little bit to the beginning of the progressive movement in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
That period, there is this middle class rising in America in the course of industrialization, and they don't like the way that the country's being governed for a whole variety of reasons. There are robber barons on one end, there are corrupt political machines on the other. The regulatory apparatus is sort of not properly constructed to deal with these huge behemoth corporations that didn't used to exist. And so there's this big question among the reform community about what we should do about it. And among these progressives, there are essentially two impulses. One impulse is to see the world as it is and to say, power is too diffuse. Like, we want to build a transit system that works. We want to build a park system that's good, or a good school system. It's something none of us can do individually, but we know it needs to be done. And so their idea is to take power as it exists and push it up into some institution that has real public authority. I call that a Hamiltonian impulse, sort of in the spirit of the Hamiltonian impulse at the beginning of the Republic. So like in that case, you would want to have a school board set up a school system and then hire teachers and like not let those teachers be corrupted by the political machine. Like you'd have this independent authority, or you'd want to have a port authority to manage the fees charged to shippers who are in the port so that there isn't competition or whatnot. So that's to move power up. There's a second impulse, and that impulse is to move power down, to say that there is sort of a corrupt series of institutions that are oppressing ordinary people, and we should take those institutions and break them up or push power back to the ordinary people.
Marc calls this the Jeffersonian impulse within progressivism.
Jeffersonian in the sense that Thomas Jefferson believed in yeoman farmers and wanting to empower them as opposed to the crown or to this decentralized government in colonial America. And so from the very beginning, progressivism is this strange marriage of this Hamiltonian Jeffersonian impulse. And almost every progressive has some element of these two ideas in their heart and in their mind. Even today, it's still true.
For example,
when you talk to a progressive today, if you were to walk into a coffee shop and see a young progressive activist and say, what are your top two voting issues? Many of them would say climate change and reproductive rights. And on climate change, like the almost universal progressive notion is that we need to have a Hamiltonian solution. We need to push power up into some institution that will tell big polluters that they need to stop emitting carbon. On reproductive rights, our viewpoint is almost exclusively Jeffersonian, right? It's like we don't want some bureaucrat telling a woman what she can do with her body. These two ideas live side by side. I don't think that for generations we've recognized the two, our intention, but they fundamentally are intention.
And one of these strains clearly dominated the progressive movement in its earlier eras.
From the late 1800s through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, really the Hamiltonian impulse prevailed. And if you look back at the progressives of those eras, they are looking to build big bureaucracies. The New Deal is building the Social Security Administration and the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And all of these are huge, big bureaucracies that are going to solve big problems. And then something happens in the late 50s through the 60s and 70s. The sort of notion that we should be pushing power up into institutions is eclipsed by the Jeffersonian impulse to pull power down. And that's the big shift.
This change is really at the core of your book's argument about, as the title suggests, why nothing works. And before we get into what this change looked like and, its effects on government as progressives sort of with this new view took power, what would you say were the main things that sort of kicked off this change? Was it a cultural change, a change to like economic circumstances? Like, why did the pendulum swing back against the Hamiltonians, as you say?
Yeah, there's this old phrase that politics is downstream of culture. And I think there was a cultural shift that was associated with the rise of the boomers, right? The previous generation had lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War and seen how crucial these big institutions were to saving the country, both from economic catastrophe and from a foreign threat. And that was woven deeply into their view of the world. But then you get the boomers who were born after the Second World War, and like that's not their experience at all. In many cases, they are growing up feeling as though these institutions that their parents venerate are corrupt, incompetent, parochial, self-interested, just bad. And then those institutions are proven through the course of the 1960s to actually be bad in many cases, right? Like Robert McNamara and the foreign policy establishment sends the country into a war they can't win.
Vietnam, that is.
Yes. Bull Connor and the Jim Crow establishment, that's sort of a centralized institution in the South that is really bad, right? It's bigoted. You get stuff like the scourge of pesticides put on American agriculture approved by the purported regulators that lead to birth defects, DDT, that's exposed by Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. You get exposure of the way the institutions that are supposed to regulate the auto industry are allowing the big three automakers to put out cars that are, by the title of Ralph Nader's book, unsafe at any speed. You're getting the downstream effects of urban renewal, which was a federal program, centralized institutions that were clearing whole blocks, often of minority neighborhoods, certainly of working class and poor neighborhoods, and just leaving rubble in their wake, never taking any time to resettle people. And the Jeffersonian impulse emerges as a reaction to it.
As Marc put it, by the 1970s, this desire among many on the left to prevent big government from doing bad things, which they saw occurring.
It moves from sort of this fringe complaint about the establishment to becoming the sort of the very essence of our political agenda. And at that point, you're getting elected as Democrats to very high office progressives who are very suspicious of power. And so like by the late 70s, progressivism itself, its aims are no longer to build up institutions. Instead, we want to push them down, erect new gauntlets to ensure that a Robert Moses type or a Robert McNamara type or Bull Connor, or like you name the old establishment figure, we want to create barriers to ensure that those kinds of characters are no longer given sort of the authority to bulldoze all the objections to what they want to do.
One way that progressives around this time sort of aimed to do that, as you write, is by putting a lot more emphasis on process and procedure when it comes to what the government does, as opposed to the sort of end goals. What exactly does that mean to be more focused on process and procedure? What did that look like?
So the thing that Robert Moses could do, or that any of these people with real power in the establishment could do, is make decisions at their own discretion. So the bridge was going to be built across the river. It could have been built at any of these spots along the edge of the river. They got to choose where they thought was best for the country and the region. And the people that were in the way of the place that they chose basically had no way of saying stop. So the way that progressives imagined that they could stop the next wannabe Robert Moses from doing something similar is to say, let's give the people who he might otherwise trample all sorts of opportunities to object, that they should have community meetings for them to weigh in, that there should be opportunities for people to demand that the government study what the environmental implications are, that there should be protections for certain kinds of buildings that are historically significant, that there should be mind paid to the economic consequences for people, say, who are fishing in the river or using the river for commercial means, that we should make sure that the areas that are bulldozed to make way for the supports for the bridges are not exclusively of one race or of a lower socioeconomic status. That in each of these cases, we can create sort of a checklist of requirements and demand that the people who are, quote unquote, deciding where the bridge goes meet all of these demands, that they have properly studied the economic consequences, the environmental consequences, the noise consequences, and that they have done that for the other options. And that if they have not properly followed the process as delineated in legislation or in regulation, that a private party would be able to bring suit to stop the project on the basis of the fact that they had not done the process correctly. And, that in theory is great, right? Like you do want Robert Moses to be taking into account all of these various issues when he is thinking through which projects to do and where to place roads and where to place housing projects. Like you want those things. But if the process is loaded up so thoroughly that you're taking lots of things into account, and that each person who has an objection can use any of these levers, you get to a point where there are too many vetoes in the system.
Well, and this brings us maybe to the beginning of the answer of the question you maybe had when you were going into Penn Station of why can't a Penn Station be rebuilt? And it's some of these sort of like layers of processes that make it so difficult. Does that seem like it kind of answered your Penn Station question in the end, or were there other
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in the Penn Station story itself, it's even more complicated because it's New York, but you've got the state is interested in doing it. Amtrak, they own the station, but they don't care what the station is like. They just want to get more people on trains. They're interested in the train track, so they don't want their money going towards that. You've got the owners of Madison Square Garden who sit above Penn Station. You've got the residents of the local community, the historic preservationists. You've got just a whole variety of generally well-intentioned participants in the negotiations. The core of it is that 2 or 3 generations earlier, Robert Moses would have said, this is what we're going to do, and that's what we would have done. And there would have been no requirement that he consider these various objections or countervailing concerns, right? All of these things, he would have just plowed through them.
Instead,
the conversations about replacing the Penn Station had begun in the 1980s. I'm commuting in 2013, so, 20 years earlier. I mean, it's just a remarkable gestation period for what seems like an obvious project. And the reason that it hadn't gotten done is because there are so many complications in the way.
Once again, this is not just about one train station in one city in America. Whether we're talking about building high-speed rail in California, green infrastructure in the Northeast, or housing across the entire U.S., so many projects today that progressives would love to see happen, Marc argues, fail because of progressives, and specifically the operationalization of this progressive impulse to make sure that power isn't abused. It wasn't a conclusion Marc expected or relished.
I would have loved nothing more than to have come through the research for this book and been able to say, this is all the Republicans. This is a legacy of the Reagan administration. George W. Bush did X, Y, and Z. Trump made it worse with, A, B, and C. Just a fair rendering of what's happened since the 50s, 60s, and 70s is that in most of these cases, the bulk of the culpability for government not working is our progressive doing. And that's the element that I think that progressives themselves have yet to grapple with.
And I guess, a question then that would follow for me is sort of like, what is an alternate path? If we have seen what the Robert Moseses of the world can do and the damage they can do when left unchecked, and we see the stasis now that any progressive who lives in any city anywhere is probably frustrated with the rate something's getting built.
Yeah.
What's a middle path? Or is there a middle path?
I think that there is and there has to be. You're absolutely right. We have at the Hamiltonian extreme, Robert Moses doing the Cross Bronx Expressway. We have at the Jeffersonian extreme, Penn Station just being left as a rat's nest for decades. And the thing that we did was that we replaced discretion with process. I think that we can reform the process so that everyone has a voice, but no one has a veto. So Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in their book Abundance, which came out a month after mine, Ezra has made famous this, what he calls the everything bagel problem. And his view is that progressives see a project and they want to get it done, and then they add all of these additional requirements that all the labor needs to be paid a certain amount of money, a living wage, that all the steel needs to be domestically manufactured, that no environmental harm can come, any harm that does come needs to be mitigated, no minority neighborhood can be blah, 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 blah.
There needs to be child care for workers at new factories was, one notable stipulation in the CHIPS Act, for example.
Correct. And so that drives up the expense, it drives up the time, it makes it so that it's almost impossible to get the project done. My concern is that in the end, there's no one empowered or assigned the role of ratifying the trade-off, of saying, yes, all right, we want to have the materials manufactured domestically That's going to be a 10% premium. Okay. Oh, it's going to be a 200% premium? No, we're going to then buy the materials from overseas. That's not worth it. That we've done a year's worth of work on the environmental implications. This design has 5% fewer detriments to the environment than this other one, but is 3 times more expensive. We're going to do a little bit more damage to the environment in order to save that cost. Or maybe the other way around. But ultimately, someone needs to be put in charge of that decision. And that's just not the way that the process works right now. We've gone from one where there is essentially Robert Moses or whomever it is who can make the decision entirely on their own to another where almost anyone can throw sand in the gears. And we need one where everyone has a voice, but no one has a veto.
When thinking about any move back towards some sort of more centralized power or hierarchical power, I think some pushback you hear is that, in the long history of authorities in the U.S. making tough trade-offs, like you were just kind of describing, that when those tough choices have to get made, disproportionately marginalized communities and people are the ones who get the short end of that stick and get harmed in those trade-offs. And that we know that history, we know what's going to happen. The sewage plant is going to get built in the poor part of town, and that it's not a risk we can take because it's been proven so consistent in history. What would you say to that sort of argument?
I'd say 3 things. First, it's right. The core of the criticism is correct. The second thing is this balance, as you say, between centralized power and diffused power is cyclical through American history, right? Sometimes power seems too concentrated, sometimes it seems too diffused. In my view, it's too diffused right now, and we need to make some way back, hopefully not to the point where we're back at Robert Moses, but right now it's too diffused so that we can't get things done. And so the third thing that I would say is you're absolutely right to be concerned that if we did give someone more discretion to make these decisions, even if we created some protections, that the short end of the stick would go to the community of color or the community of working class families, but that the element now is that those families aren't being served by government.
Because government isn't getting
Correct.
stuff done in it. Yeah.
Right. If the idea is to create a clean energy economy, it's those neighborhoods that are going to have fewer carbon-emitting buses, that create asthma in the community, so we'll have cleaner buses. But in order to do that, you need to have clean energy infrastructure, right? In all of these cases, the beneficiaries should be people who have fewer means or who've been marginalized, and government can't serve them right now. And then worse, if Democrats are the party of government and government doesn't work, voters are going to notice that. And if they're paying attention, it's almost as though we're rolling out the red carpet for Donald Trump to steal their support. Government needs to be competent. It needs to be able to make trade-offs. It needs to be able to make decisions. It needs to be able to do things expeditiously so that people have faith in government and will remain loyal to the party that wants authentically to do well for those who are without.
But I can't help but think at the same time, it's not like the progressives have done nothing recently. I think, our last president passed a massive infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Democratic president before that, Obama, overhauled healthcare in a pretty profound way. The Democratic Party still does some big things from time to time. Is it fair to lay this sort of atrophy all at the hands of progressives? Or were the people opposing progressives playing an active role in this kind of destruction as well?
Well, let me answer that in 2 ways. First, Republicans should not be given a free hand here, right? They have not been helpful. Their view is that if you just got government out of the way, all these problems would be fixed on their own. That seems laughable to me. There are lots of examples in American history where the free market by itself does not serve people well, and then people are left behind, and then that's a real scourge. So the sort of notion that government is by itself always the wrong answer is utterly wrong, in my view. So let's ascribe that problem to them, but also recognize if you are progressive, our job is to find a way to pick off support from those who would otherwise vote for them and provide them with a better alternative. I don't have any influence over the conservatives. I'm not a conservative. I don't share their ideology. My goal cannot be to scream at them so that they begin to share my point of view. That's not a productive use of my time. What I can do is try to encourage us to provide a more compelling vision of what government can do and to show that government is an effective tool to people who are on the margins. So if you look, to your point, you're absolutely right. We passed a bunch of bills, both under Obama and under Biden recently, that were all providing money and real resources to do big things. So among those things, the bipartisan infrastructure bill included $7.5 billion to put up electric vehicle chargers in nodes of the federal highway system that otherwise wouldn't have them built. That was passed in 2021. By the time Biden is leaving in 2024, $7.5 billion later, only a few dozen had been built. Now, there are very logical explanations for that, right? Like Biden and the Biden administration did not have a federal workforce that was able to do this in the way that the Tennessee Valley Authority, 90 years earlier had been able to connect poor farms in the Upper South to the grid. The utilities in those local spaces needed to run wires to the places where they were going to put up these new electrical vehicle chargers. Like, it was a very complex, cumbersome process. But if you were an ordinary citizen and that if you were to buy an electric car, that you could call an electrician and have them install a charger on your garage, like in the course of a day or two. Like, here we are 3 years later and these charging stations aren't up. It's an outrage, like, to the ordinary consumer.
I was going to say, as you were describing the importance for so many progressive causes of a, effective, ambitious, dare I say, efficient central government. You've been working on this book for a long time. It comes out right as President Trump is in a second term, and there's all this talk about government efficiency, and we are going to, streamline government, get rid of, bureaucrats who are maybe gumming up the works in various ways. Some of the language sounds like similar language that could be used by progressives who are advocating the type of reform you are, but clearly I think it's to very different ends. So I wonder, just what have you made of this moment?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a confusing moment. And for me to recommend at the moment of the beginning of Donald Trump's second administration that we give more unfettered power to the executive branch, for progressive to be arguing that seems particularly noteworthy. And rarely do I have an interview where somebody doesn't ask me about it. So you're absolutely right. I'd say first that the core notion that in its best form, Doge and what Elon Musk is doing is controversial. Like, there are certain things that he's done that progressives have reacted to furiously that seem entirely reasonable to me. Like, asking federal bureaucrats, what have they accomplished in the last week? Like, that is a question that people in the private sector are asked all the time. And if they're not producing, they are let go. And I think that progressives should view the federal bureaucracy in much the same way. If people are not actually adding value to the public interest as they collect a salary from the taxpayer, like, that should be very angering for those of us who are progressive as well. So there's a place where I was sort of put off by criticism of Musk. But that's sort of on the margins. More interesting to me is that the people that he's firing are in many cases the people that helped move things through those series of hurdles and barriers. So it sounds like the sort of the narrative in his mind is that these people are gumming up the works, and so if we get rid of them, things will be decided more expeditiously. But that's exactly wrong. Like, the problem is the underlying gauntlet, and these people are doing their damnedest to move projects forward. So you're going to get rid of the people that are speeding things along. It's just going to take longer. It's really, really counterproductive. More to the point, and this is the final point about this, people are frustrated that government isn't working. And so they've turned to these guys to take a sledgehammer to the system. And we may not like that, but the solution to that is not saying, let's preserve the system as it was. Our voice should be, people are right. The government doesn't work, and we're going to find ways to make it work more expeditiously.
And as Marc sees it, if progressives did that and dedicated themselves to making government work more effectively and efficiently once again, it wouldn't just be good for people who, say, want a new Penn Station. It would also be good politics for progressives.
I know so many progressives who spend every election night watching their television, white-knuckled, not knowing, just hoping that they've done enough to convince the country that Trump and Republicans are bad. And that's a terrible way to live your life one election to the next. What we ought to be doing is spending our time thinking, what are the things we can change about our own creed that will make us more appealing to those same people so we don't have to worry about Trump? That's what this book was written to do. This was a wake-up call to progressives that there are things that we can do ourselves now. Set the Republicans aside, set the screaming aside. What are the things that we can do with our own agenda that would make it so that government works so that people felt comfortable casting ballots for our preferred candidates in elections moving forward?
Well, it is certainly a wake-up call of a book, and I hope anyone interested in the future of progressivism picks it up. So, Marc Dunkelman, thank you so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Thanks so much for having me. Great conversation.
This episode of Trending Globally was produced by me, Dan Richards, and Zach Hirsch, with production assistance from Errol Danahy. Our theme music is by Henry Bloomfield. Additional music by the Blue Dot Sessions. If you like this show, please leave us a rating and review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps other people to find us. And if you haven't subscribed to our show, please do that too. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Trending Globally.